The video opens by placing the viewer right in the middle of a contradiction that feels impossible to ignore. The narrator explains that Jay Pharoah isn't just good at impressions, he's elite, almost unsettlingly accurate, the kind of talent that makes people forget they're listening to a comedian at all. His voices don't sound like exaggerations or parodies, they sound real. And that's exactly what makes his story so confusing, because with this level of ability, the natural assumption would be superstardom. Movies, massive tours, constant mainstream visibility. But that didn't happen. Instead, the narrator frames the mystery at the center of the video. How does someone this gifted end up feeling overlooked? The audience is told that Jay Pharoah did everything right. He put in the time, mastered his craft, impressed the right people, and still somehow ended up on the outside looking in. The intro doesn't give answers yet. It simply plants the idea that something behind the scenes shifted the course of his career in ways most people never noticed. And as the narrator hints at industry politics, quiet decisions, and moments that changed everything, the viewer is left with one clear thought. This story goes much deeper than impressions. The narrator then dives into what actually makes Jay Pharoah different, breaking down why his skill level isn't normal even among impressionists. Most performers master a handful of voices and build entire careers around them. Jay didn't stop at a few. He absorbed accents, rhythms, speech patterns, pauses, breathing, and even personality traits. The narrator explains how Jay could move effortlessly between rappers, presidents, actors, and animated characters without losing accuracy. What stands out most is that his impressions don't rely on catchphrases. They rely on understanding. He captures how people think, not just how they sound. The narrator emphasizes that this is why audiences react so strongly, because the voices feel alive. It's also why other comedians often look shocked when he performs. The video frames Jay as someone whose talent almost breaks the rules of comedy, someone whose skill feels more like a musician with perfect pitch than a stand-up doing bits. And that level of mastery sets expectations dangerously high. Because when you're this good, people assume the industry will automatically reward you. But as the narrator subtly hints, raw ability doesn't always translate to long-term power, and that gap between talent and recognition becomes the tension driving the rest of the story. Before television, before major stages, the narrator explains that Jay Pharoah was already putting in work where almost no one was paying attention. Long before short-form clips dominated social media, Jay was uploading impression videos online, refining his craft in public without guarantees of success. The narrator describes these years as quiet, obsessive, and crucial. Jay wasn't chasing trends. He was studying voices, replaying interviews, and experimenting until the impressions felt perfect. The video positions him as someone ahead of his time, using the internet before it became the fast track it is today. There was no algorithm pushing him forward, no viral machine backing him, just consistency and discipline. The narrator points out that these early videos slowly circulated among comedy fans and industry insiders, creating a low buzz that eventually reached the right ears. This section reinforces the idea that Jay's rise wasn't luck, it was earned. And when opportunity finally came knocking, it felt like the natural reward for years of invisible effort. But the narrator also plants a warning here. Sometimes the thing that gets you noticed isn't the thing that keeps you protected once you arrive. When the narrator arrives at Jay Pharoah joining Saturday Night Live, the tone shifts to excitement and expectation. This was the moment that was supposed to change everything. SNL has launched legends, and Jay seemed tailor-made for it. The narrator explains how his impressions immediately stood out, especially his take on high-profile figures like Barack Obama, Denzel Washington, Chris Rock, and Jay-Z. Audience reactions were strong. Viewers at home saw a future star. But as the narrator carefully explains, what the audience saw and what happened internally didn't always align. Despite his versatility, Jay often found himself appearing in limited roles. His voices were praised, but not always written into sketches consistently. The narrator doesn't accuse outright, but suggests a growing disconnect between his ability and how it was being used. This section frames SNL not just as an opportunity, but as the beginning of tension. Because while being on the show gave Jay massive visibility, it also quietly restricted him. And the narrator hints that once expectations are raised that high, disappointment hits even harder when things start to shift. The narrator then addresses the moment that surprised fans the most, Jay Pharoah's exit from SNL. At the time, many viewers didn't understand why someone so popular would suddenly be gone. The narrator explains that Jay later spoke about feeling underused and boxed into certain lanes. Sketches didn't always reflect his range, and opportunities he expected never fully materialized. This section carefully touches on uncomfortable undertones without making direct claims. The narrator frames it as a pattern that has repeated itself in comedy history, where some performers feel celebrated publicly but limited privately. Jay's departure didn't come with a dramatic announcement, which made it even more confusing. One moment he was a rising star, the next he was off the show entirely. The narrator emphasizes how quickly momentum can disappear in entertainment once a platform is removed. And for Jay, that shift forced a hard reset. The video makes it clear that leaving SNL wasn't just a career move, it was a psychological turning point that reshaped how he navigated the industry going forward. At this point, the narrator introduces one of the most ironic and serious chapters of Jay Pharoah's story. The very tool that made him special, his voice, was suddenly at risk. The narrator explains how Jay revealed he suffered vocal cord damage, allegedly linked to working conditions that pushed his voice beyond safe limits. Doctors warned him that continuing without rest could permanently affect his ability to perform. For an impressionist, that's not just an injury, that's an identity crisis. The narrator lingers on the weight of that moment, explaining how close Jay came to losing everything he built. There's no exaggeration here, just the quiet realization that talent alone doesn't make someone invincible. This section deepens the emotional stakes of the video. It reframes Jay not as a performer chasing fame, but as someone fighting to preserve the very thing that defines him. And just when it feels like this could be the end of the story, the narrator signals that Jay wasn't finished yet. Instead of disappearing, the narrator explains that Jay Pharoah re-emerged in a different way. Podcasts, interviews, and viral clips became his new stage. Cultural moments, especially high-profile controversies involving celebrities and politicians, gave his impressions renewed relevance. The narrator highlights how Jay's takes on figures like Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Will Smith, and Chris Rock began circulating widely again. But this time, he wasn't tied to a single institution. He was independent, free to speak, adapt, and respond to the moment. The video frames this phase as a quieter comeback, driven by skill rather than hype. Jay didn't need sketches written for him anymore. He could create moments on his own. And the narrator suggests that this independence may have been the missing piece all along, because now his talent wasn't being filtered, it was being unleashed. The narrator then zooms out to ask the uncomfortable question many avoid. Why didn't Hollywood ever fully commit to Jay Pharoah? The answer isn't simple. The narrator explains that the industry often prefers predictability over versatility. It's easier to market someone with one recognizable trait than someone who can become anyone. Jay didn't fit neatly into a box. He wasn't just an impressionist, a stand-up, or an actor. He was all of them, and that made him harder to package. This section frames Jay as someone whose talent was too flexible for an industry that thrives on labels. The narrator doesn't portray him as rejected, but as mismatched. And sometimes that mismatch costs people opportunities that their skill alone should guarantee. The video closes with the narrator reframing Jay Pharoah's journey, not as a failure, not as wasted potential, but as an unfinished story. The narrator reminds viewers that Jay is still performing, still evolving, still sharpening his craft. His career didn't collapse, it simply refused to follow the expected path. And in an industry obsessed with control, that independence might be the most powerful outcome of all. The final note leaves the viewer thinking beyond impressions, beyond fame, and beyond platforms. Because sometimes the most talented voices aren't silenced, they just choose to speak on their own terms.